They say memory is slippery in the cold, but some things never melt. The night before we drove up to Hollow Pines, my daughter drew a picture. It showed a woman falling from a mountain, arms outstretched, swallowed by white. A small figure stood at the edge, watching, one hand raised, not in warning, but in farewell. I asked her who the people were. She shrugged. We hadn't seen my brother Elliot in 5 years. He'd invited us with polished words and pictures of a secluded luxury lodge blanketed in snow. Just family, he wrote. Time to reconnect. 3 nights. That's all it was supposed to be. But when the snow started falling, I realized too late. It wasn't a retreat. It was a setup, and I had brought my daughter into the lion's den. We drove up the winding mountain road in silence, the tires crunching over gravel slick with frost. Pines closed in on either side, tall and unbending, like sentinels bearing witness. The GPS had long since lost signal. Clara sat curled in the back seat, clutching a worn plush rabbit she hadn't touched in months. Her breath fogged the window as she stared out, her face unreadable. The resort appeared suddenly, as if it had risen from the trees itself. Hollow Pines. A glass and cedar structure perched like a crown above a frozen lake, its enormous windows glowing warm gold in the growing dusk. A place that could be called beautiful, if not for the stillness that surrounded it, a stillness that felt rehearsed, calculated, almost waiting. Elliot waited at the entrance, posture poised, expression too smooth. Time had only refined him, features sharper, hair touched by silver, confidence shaped by wealth. He embraced me with theatrical warmth. His cologne clung like memory, rich and controlled. Clara shrank beside me, unmoving. The lodge's interior radiated curated luxury. Stone walls, soft lighting, air infused with spice and something antiseptic beneath. Everything gleamed, everything belonged. The silence felt oppressive, as if the building itself listened. No background music, no murmur of staff. Just the soft creak of floorboards, the tick of an antique clock, the subtle whisper of fire. Veronica appeared, descending the staircase with practiced elegance. Her movements were precise, her face a studied display of welcome. The way she scanned Clara's face and held her gaze for a moment too long unsettled me. The smile didn't touch her eyes, which flicked over every detail like an appraiser assessing value. We were shown to our rooms. Clara's was pastel and sterile, perfect in the way magazine pages are perfect, untouched. She sat on the bed and said nothing, her eyes following the drifting snow beyond the window. The room swallowed her. She seemed smaller here, her presence dimmed by the space, like a whisper in a cathedral. My own room was clinical in its calm, pale gray walls, clean linens, and an oversized window that stared into the woods. It felt like a stage set before a performance. I unpacked with mechanical motions, fighting the chill that had settled under my skin. Every object had a place, every fold in the blanket smoothed with purpose. But nothing felt lived in. It was all surface, no depth. Dinner was precision and polish. The table was arranged as if for a photo shoot. Every plate, every fork, perfectly placed. The food was flawless, its flavor muted by the undercurrent of performance in every movement. Conversation fluttered around stock topics, safe, shallow things. Beneath every glance and polite remark, I felt a subtle choreography I hadn't been invited to learn. There was a rhythm, an understanding I wasn't part of. Clara barely touched her meal. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes distant, as if her mind lingered elsewhere, or listened to something I couldn't hear. When I placed a hand over hers, her skin was cold. She didn't look at me, but I felt the tremor in her fingers. That night, she curled beneath heavy blankets without protest. She didn't ask for a story or the nightlight. Her silence spoke of something deeper than fatigue. I lingered beside her, unsure who needed the comfort more. Her breathing was shallow, not quite restful, as if her body slept but her mind remained watchful. The moment I returned to my own room, the stillness returned with a vengeance. The smell of the sheets, faintly chemical, gnawed at my nerves. I lay down, but sleep refused me. My body floated just below waking, suspended in a haze. My heartbeat echoed louder than the wind. I turned over again and again, tangled in the blankets, seeking warmth I couldn't find. Sometime in the night, a jolt woke me. Not a sound, but the absence of one. The wind had stopped. The world outside the window was deathly still. I rose instinctively and walked the dim hallway. My feet made no sound on the thick carpet. Clara's door stood slightly ajar. Inside, she lay facing the window, eyes wide and alert. Her body was rigid, barely breathing. The room was colder than mine, the heat turned low, the windows fogged at the corners. When I crossed to the glass, I saw nothing but frozen branches etched against a moonlit sky. Our room was high above the ground. Still, something inside me turned to ice. My instincts screamed, though logic offered no reason. She said someone had knocked. I held her until her breathing slowed. Her small frame pressed against mine, trembling. She hadn't dreamed it. That much was clear. Something had disturbed her, something real. Whether a sound or a presence, I didn't know. But I believed her. Back in my bed, I stared at the ceiling. I could no longer ignore the sensation, a presence behind the window, something unseen but deeply felt. The cold crept through the walls, no matter how tightly I pulled the blanket. I lay awake until the first gray threads of dawn began to lighten the sky. Morning arrived without comfort. The lodge smelled of fresh bread and wood polish, but the scent couldn't mask the dread lodged in my chest. Veronica served breakfast with perfect grace, as if the night before had never existed. Her hands moved with fluid precision, gestures too graceful to be spontaneous. Elliot was engrossed in a newspaper, the print acting as a shield. Clara sat wordless again, her food untouched. Her expression had shifted, not fear, but resignation, as if she had already accepted something she hadn't told me. Her small hand slipped into mine beneath the table, and the coldness of her skin mirrored my own unease. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They stayed focused on the window, where snowflakes drifted in lazy spirals. Talk of hiking followed, a short trail, beautiful views, nothing strenuous. The suggestion floated like a lure. It was framed as leisure, but something in the tone felt rehearsed. Clara looked away. My headache pulsed behind my eyes. I could feel myself sliding into something I didn't understand. A script I hadn't read. A game I hadn't agreed to play. After breakfast, we were encouraged to explore. I wandered the hallways while Clara returned to her room, claiming tiredness. Each corridor of the lodge was immaculate. No personal photos, no signs of occupation. Just polished surfaces, strategically placed art, and that constant, unnatural quiet. The staff were ghost-like, present but never visible, movements timed to avoid overlap. I found a reading room lined with books that looked untouched. The fireplace there burned low, unattended, yet steady. I sat for a while in a high-backed chair, trying to read, but the words swam. My mind kept circling back to Clara's knock, to the cold in her room, to the silence that felt alive. Outside, the snow sparkled like a trap. The lake was too still. The trees didn't move. The branches, weighed down with ice, bent toward the windows like voyeurs. The landscape looked frozen in time, beautiful and eerie. Later, Clara stood beside me at the glass. Her reflection merged with mine, both of us staring at the same blank woods. Her hand gripped mine tighter. And I understood, without words, that the silence had started watching us back. We weren't just guests here. We were being observed, measured, and perhaps already being mourned. That night, something inside me fractured. It was not a single event, not even a distinct sensation, more like the slow dissolution of time itself. The evening blurred, stretched too far, then snapped back again. I remembered brushing my teeth in the mirror, the sterile bathroom lights buzzing above. Then nothing. I woke up face down in the bed, fully clothed. My mouth tasted of copper, and my limbs were sunk into the mattress like sandbags. The clock read 3:47 a.m., but I had no memory of returning from dinner, no memory of undressing. The light on the hallway wall had been turned off, something I never did. My body moved sluggishly as I sat up, a heavy fog hanging inside my skull. The cold from the window seeped through the glass in thin, invisible fingers. I stood and stumbled to the door. The hallway greeted me like a tunnel in a dream. Shadows bent in the corners. Clara's door was shut. My hand hesitated on the knob. I listened. Nothing. Then, barely perceptible, a breath. I pushed the door open. She was asleep but curled too tightly into herself, limbs knotted beneath the covers. Her plush rabbit lay discarded on the floor, a casualty of some silent battle. I picked it up, placed it beside her, and brushed her hair from her face. Her cheeks were damp. I hadn't heard her cry. Back in my room, I sat on the bed and tried to piece together a sequence, what I had eaten, whether I had finished my wine. But the hours after dinner remained sealed behind a thick veil. That veil, I realized, had not been born of exhaustion. It had been manufactured. The next morning, light came slowly. Gray and indifferent, it spilled over the windows without warmth. The smell of cinnamon and citrus filtered faintly through the hall, yet my stomach recoiled. I dressed with clumsy fingers and moved toward the dining room. Veronica greeted me with poised calm, her hands gliding effortlessly as she arranged cut fruit on porcelain. Elliot sat by the fire again, unmoved from the day before, his expression masked behind a half-raised coffee cup. The air felt performative, like watching a stage play from the wings. Claire arrived last. Her eyes were ringed with fatigue, her body moving as though underwater. She didn't speak. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a fork, then changed her mind. She kept glancing at the window, the way an animal watches for the silhouette of a predator. The conversation that morning was oddly mechanical, every phrase measured like it had been drafted in advance. I nodded where appropriate, but something kept whispering beneath the surface of my thoughts. This is not hospitality. This is containment. By mid-morning, the air in the lodge seemed heavier, thicker. Even the light seemed to dull against the windows, unable to penetrate the creeping unease that wrapped around everything. I began to explore again, more deliberately this time. The west wing of the lodge had doors that were locked. I tested several discreetly, then found one slightly ajar. A study, bookshelves, leather furniture, and a low-burning fire. But the desk was what caught my attention. Stacks of paper, some loose, some clipped. One stood out, a printed email thread. The subject line read, "Custodial Authority Preliminary Draft." The words clung to my thoughts like burrs. I imagined what those drafts might contain: legal arguments, character assessments, professional opinions warped by subtle lies. My hand hovered over the pages, torn between reading and fleeing. Footsteps approached. I slipped out silently, my pulse a frantic metronome in my ears. Later, I found Clara sitting on the staircase, half in shadow, her eyes red-rimmed. I sat beside her. She leaned into me without a word. Her hand slipped something into mine, a folded piece of paper, the corner damp with sweat. Inside were 6 words, written in a child's blocky scrawl. "Don't drink anything. They're watching." My hands trembled as I folded it back and slipped it into my coat. I kissed the top of her head and forced a calm breath. My vision sharpened as adrenaline dulled the fog. The paper burned like a warning brand in my pocket. Every hour from then on became surveillance. I watched how Elliot's gaze followed me when he thought I wasn't looking. How Veronica's eyes lingered too long when I poured my own coffee but never drank it. The way their bodies moved through the lodge like pieces on a chessboard. I began pretending, holding cups, smiling, laughing at comments that made no sense, playing the guest they expected me to be. By evening, the fatigue returned, but I resisted. I faked yawns, touched food to my lips without eating, sipped water, and poured the rest into the bathroom sink. I pretended to lose track of time, let my eyes go glassy with manufactured sleepiness. I let the silence press in, let the eyes believe I was fading. Outside the windows, the lake no longer shimmered. It seemed to absorb light instead, like a mirror turned inward. The woods had become a wall, their shadows deeper, their stillness less natural. The wind had died. Nothing stirred. After dinner, I noticed something strange. The hallway mirror near the stairs had shifted slightly. It tilted a degree too far left, revealing a sliver of unpainted wall behind it. When I passed it again later, it had been corrected. They were watching not just through glances, but through walls. I took mental notes of every creak in the floor, every misplaced object, every subtle change. A dish out of order. A drawer slightly ajar. A scent that hadn't been there before, sweet, sharp, and wrong, like almonds and something metallic. When the second night came, I lay in bed fully awake, still as a corpse, breath-controlled, ears straining. The house made sounds then, not creaks or groans, but footsteps too soft to be casual. The click of doors, then silence. The brush of cloth against wood. A whisper too faint to interpret. The air was thicker now, like it had been waiting for this hour. I felt it coil around the baseboards and beneath the doorframe. I kept still. I imagined the sound of a key turning in a lock. Imagined eyes just beyond the threshold. Imagined Clara's voice rising from a dream, warning me. Minutes passed. Or hours. Time lost meaning again. In that darkness, I began to understand. This was not some growing paranoia. The signs were too sharp, too many. This was a net slowly tightening. The game had already started, and I was 3 moves behind. By morning, the snow had thickened. It drifted in slow spirals outside the window, cloaking the landscape in silence so absolute it seemed to erase the world. The sky was pale gray, a sheet of blankness pressing down, soft but suffocating. The air inside the lodge was warmer than usual, as if the house was preparing to cradle something rather than comfort it. I moved through the halls like a shadow, barefoot on cold wood. Every instinct was now sharpened to survival. I noticed things, how the smell of the fireplace shifted from cedar to something acrid, as though it were burning something not meant to be seen. How the curtains never swayed, even when windows were cracked. How the clocks ticked in perfect synchrony, every second locked in rhythm, as if choreographed. Clara was different too. Her movements were smaller, more cautious. She no longer asked questions. She no longer hummed while brushing her hair or left her drawings scattered across the room. When I found her staring out the window at dawn, her breath fogging the glass, I saw her write something in the condensation and then quickly wipe it away. Her body seemed smaller now, withdrawn into itself like something preparing for hibernation or hiding. She had stopped speaking entirely. The breakfast table was a parade of normalcy. Warm croissants, herbal tea, a fruit salad too meticulously arranged. Every element on the table looked photographed rather than eaten. But the air around it was brittle, thin as glass stretched to its breaking point. Elliot read his newspaper with unreadable calm, flipping each page as if rehearsing the motion. Veronica smiled too often, and only with her lips. Her eyes tracked every movement I made, like a predator pretending to be curious. I ate nothing. Clara mirrored me. When Elliot asked if we'd like to go for a snowshoe walk, his voice carried too much brightness. The kind of tone used to cover a lie, to distract a child from a burning building. I declined. So did Clara, with a silent shake of the head. Her eyes never left the frost gathering on the window pane. They didn't push. Instead, they went themselves. Their silhouettes vanished into the whiteness beyond the trees. The quiet that followed was so complete, it buzzed in my ears. As if the house, too, was holding its breath. I used the time to search. The study door was locked this time. I tried the handle with deliberate slowness, listening for movement. Nothing. I checked the kitchen next. Gleaming counters, cabinets filled with pristine tools, all unlived in. Nothing seemed touched. No signs of real meals prepared. It was like walking through a showroom. Everything was there, but nothing belonged to anyone. In the sitting room, I opened drawers behind books, beneath rugs. I found a hairline crack in the wall behind a framed landscape. Tucked inside was a flash drive sealed in a sandwich bag. The sight of it startled me more than it should have. It didn't belong in this polished simulation of comfort. It was real, tangible, a seed of something hidden and unfinished. I didn't have time to explore it. Not yet. By early afternoon, the snow deepened, blanketing every visible surface. The trees now stood like statues behind gauze, their forms blurred, their branches bowing with white weight. Clara sat near the fire, curled into the same blanket she'd used the night before. Her face was turned toward the flames, but her eyes flicked up at me when I entered the room. She said nothing. Her silence was now her armor, forged and worn with quiet resolve. I sat beside her, and she leaned against me without hesitation. Her heartbeat felt too fast for someone so still. Her breath came in shallow pulses. I wrapped my arm around her and felt her fingers curl into the fabric of my shirt like she was anchoring herself. The warmth of the fire should have felt comforting, but instead, it carried the same weight as everything else in the lodge, manufactured, intentional, part of a larger stage. I stared into the flames, wondering what it was trying to burn away. That evening, I made a choice. I set my phone to record and left it hidden behind a vent in the corner of the room, angled just enough to capture the door. I faked taking my medication, the ones Veronica insisted I might need to help me rest. I left the pill on my tongue, then spat it into tissue when I turned away, wrapping it carefully into toilet paper and flushing it down in pieces. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark with eyes wide open, watching the light from the hallway flicker once, then vanish. The silence settled in again, thick and electric. I felt it crawling up the walls, winding around the bedposts, seeping beneath the mattress. Footsteps came again, this time slower, more deliberate. I counted them. 3 sets. 3 distinct gates. Outside my door, the floorboards groaned. Then silence. Then the doorknob turned, not fully, just enough to test, just enough to confirm. They didn't know I was awake. Somewhere in the darkness of the room, Clara stirred. She didn't speak. She didn't cry out. But I felt her small hand reach across the sheets, finding mine. Her fingers were icy, her grip trembling. We held onto each other in that stillness, a quiet pact sealed by fear. My breathing slowed to match hers. The seconds stretched. I imagined what might be on the other side of the door. I imagined the conversation they'd had before ascending the stairs. The way they would pause at the threshold, deciding who would try the knob first. The shadows didn't move. The door didn't open. But the knowledge of their presence, just inches away, changed everything. The game had changed. We weren't just being observed now. We were being rehearsed. We were the scene being staged. Tomorrow, I knew, something would happen. The plan, whatever it was nearing its final act. I felt it in the way the walls pressed inward, in the weight of the glances exchanged, in the way Clara had begun to flinch at the sound of approaching footsteps. But tonight, we still had the silence. And the silence, finally, had started speaking back. And I had learned to listen. Morning arrived with the quiet insistence of snow pressing against glass. The storm had buried everything in sight: pathways, branches, boundaries. It was as if the outside world no longer existed. Just us, sealed in. Clara barely stirred. Her face was pale, her mouth downturned even in sleep. I brushed her hair back and tried to believe in the small piece of her expression, but dread pulled at my ribs like an undertow. Something inside her was unraveling slowly, quietly, like threads slipping from a frayed hem. I made coffee and drank it black, bitter on my tongue. My hands were shaking slightly as I held the mug. I stared out the kitchen window, memorizing the shapes of trees, wondering which might be closest to the ridge, which path might lead to an end. The snow had disguised everything. Even my thoughts felt muffled beneath it. Veronica appeared behind me without sound. Her presence landed like a sudden draft, unsettling the hairs on the back of my neck. She always moved that way, as if the house itself yielded space to her. She spoke, but her words didn't matter. It was her tone, bright, brittle, a gloss overwrought. Her lips moved, but it was her eyes I watched. They held a gleam too polished, too rehearsed. I wondered if she had practiced this smile in the mirror, the way some people practice lies. She asked if we had slept well. I lied. She smiled. The silence after her footsteps faded was louder than her voice had been. Later, I crept back into the study. The lock had been changed. The metal was cold under my fingers, as if recently handled. I paused for a moment, listening. No sound. Only the wind brushing against the windows, soft and deceitful. But I had found another way. A narrow door in the laundry hallway, one that led to a hidden stairwell. I'd seen a draft stir the edges of an old tapestry the day before, one that seemed oddly placed between 2 rooms. Behind it, a service passage, dusty and unused, lined with faded wallpaper and the scent of mothballs and disuse. At the bottom of the stairs, a small room with file boxes, a dented safe, and a shelf lined with VHS tapes. No labels, just dates. The air was cold and stale, and I could hear the faint hum of something mechanical, perhaps a heater or a recording device. I opened a file. Custody documents. My name, Elliot's name. Clara's birth certificate photocopied and highlighted. Next to it, a printed letter from a family court mediator, flagged in yellow ink. A few words leapt off the page: instability, temporary guardianship, emergency ruling. My heart sank. My knees nearly buckled. They had been preparing this, building a case, brick by brick, while feeding me wine and smiles and sweet distractions. I clenched the paper in my hands, crumpling it by accident, and had to force myself to smooth it out again. One tape stood out. It bore the date of Elliot's wedding to Veronica. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't recognize the name on the envelope tucked beside it, Mara. I didn't know who Mara was. But something about that name filled me with cold certainty. When I returned upstairs, Clara was drawing. She had not drawn for 2 days. Now, She was tracing a large figure with wide shoulders, facing away. At the edge of the page, a smaller figure stood beside trees. In the sky above them, a red sun dripped color like a wound. The figure beside the trees was barely visible, only outlined faintly in gray. I crouched beside her, watching her color in silence. The scratch of her pencil was the only sound. When she looked at me, her eyes were unreadable. I saw an old intelligence there. Fear honed into something sharper. She had become still in a way only children who have seen too much too young become. It made my chest ache. I asked who the person in the drawing was. She shook her head. I didn't press her. That night, dinner was strangely festive. Candlelight, music drifting low from hidden speakers, wine poured with too much flourish. Veronica wore red, blood red, fitted, elegant. Her lipstick matched. She floated from chair to table like a woman hosting a gala, not a quiet family meal. Elliot toasted to fresh beginnings. His voice trembled only slightly at the edges. Perhaps he believed his lie. Perhaps the ritual made it feel true. I smiled. I held the glass but didn't drink. I let my gaze drift. I let my eyelids droop. I played the role of someone sedated, softened, safe. When dessert came, I barely touched it. Clara said she was tired. I said I would take her upstairs. Elliot nodded too quickly. Veronica's wineglass tilted in her hand like a pendulum. Upstairs, the air felt thinner, tighter. I moved quickly. I checked the phone recording. The night before, 3 figures had stood outside our door. I recognized their outlines by posture alone. One had stooped slightly. My father used to do that when he paced. Another had her arms folded tight. Veronica. They had whispered, debated, argued. Then they'd left. Clara watched me silently as I scrolled through the footage. Her mouth a thin line, her fingers twisting her pajama sleeve into knots. She sat very still, but the energy beneath her skin was vibrating. She said, quietly, tomorrow, they'll try again. I asked how she knew. She answered with a whisper, because I heard them say it. Then she looked away. There was a moment where neither of us spoke. The room held its breath with us. I reached over, held her hand, and felt the tremor beneath her skin. Something in her had hardened, but not broken. Not yet. The night came heavy and deliberate, thick clouds rolling over the stars like an omen. The wind had settled, leaving the world breathless and waiting. It was the kind of night that didn't just fall, it descended, cloaked in tension and the promise of something final. After Clara drifted into a shallow sleep, I lay beside her fully clothed, my heart thudding a steady rhythm against the silence. Every creak of the wood, every distant rustle of wind felt amplified, as if the house itself was listening. The room was darker than it had ever been, the shadows thicker, heavier. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to burn with a lower flame, its glow swallowed by the walls like a secret. I'd hidden the flash drive in the lining of my coat, stuffed at the back of the closet behind an old wool blanket. It was all I had, the only piece of truth I might never get to show. I stared at the ceiling and counted my breaths. I had one goal, survive the next hours. I didn't know what their exact plan was, only that it had a time, a script, and we were both cast in roles we hadn't auditioned for. Clara's breathing was light beside me, too steady to be sleep. She was pretending too. We were 2 statues beneath the same blanket, waiting for the dark to breathe first. Just before midnight, the silence cracked. A soft, purposeful sound, the creak of floorboards shifting beneath deliberate weight. Then another. Then the hush of a hand brushing fabric, the click of something metal. Footsteps slow and measured made their way down the hall. I did not move. I did not breathe harder. I became a shape in the bed, nothing more. Clara's hand slipped into mine beneath the blankets. Her grip was firm, trembling with quiet tension. She was awake. She had been waiting too. The doorknob turned slowly. The door opened in inches, not all at once. The air shifted. The sound of the door moving against the frame was quieter than my pulse. 3 silhouettes entered, like shadows made flesh. Their outlines cut against the pale light from the hallway. They moved slowly, confidently, like they had done this before. Like this wasn't murder, just another transaction. They did not speak. Elliot moved toward the bed. In his hand, something glinted, a syringe, narrow and clinical. Veronica stayed close to the door, arms folded, watching like a handler directing a scene. A third figure, my father, stood by the window, his face turned outward, as if avoiding his own reflection. Elliot reached the side of the bed and leaned close, searching for signs of wakefulness. I kept my breath slow, deep. I let my arm hang limp over the edge of the mattress. Clara turned slightly, just enough to draw his attention. He paused. Then she whispered, soft as snow, "Don't." Everything froze. The room contracted. Elliot's hand hovered. Veronica hissed a breath between her teeth. My father shifted, guilt, maybe, or something more primal. No one spoke, but the tension screamed. Then I moved. With the force of adrenaline, I threw the blanket off and kicked Elliot hard in the chest. He stumbled backward, crashing into the nightstand, the syringe flying from his hand and skidding across the floor with a dull clank. Veronica lunged, shrieking something incoherent, but I was already at the closet. I ripped open the door and grabbed the emergency alarm I'd hidden earlier, clipped from the fire safety wall downstairs, rewired, timed. I hit it. A piercing siren filled the room, cutting the air like a blade. Red lights flared to life along the hallway, the sound echoing through every timber beam. Panic flickered on Veronica's face. Elliot swore, lunging for me. Clara screamed, a raw sound that ripped through the alarm like thunder. I grabbed her and backed toward the balcony. My hand gripped her arm tightly, too tightly, but I couldn't let go. Below us, the snow looked like glass, smooth and lethal. My breath billowed in clouds. The doors swung open. Wind poured in. Cold flooded the room, biting into my skin. But I didn't care. Behind me, Elliot shouted. He was coming. I turned just as he reached us. His face was twisted, red, his hands reaching. Then, boots on the stairs. A voice barked, loud, sharp, official. Step back. Hands where we can see them. Elliot froze. His eyes darted to the hallway. Veronica ran. I saw her silhouette vanish into the dark of the hall like smoke. My father raised his hand slowly, stepping away from the window. His face was pale, sunken. In that moment, he looked old. Broken. It was over in seconds. Security pulled them from the room, one by one. Orders were shouted. Flashlights swept. I stood holding Clara, trembling. Her face buried in my chest, her shoulders shaking. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We had crossed a threshold where tears had no meaning. I had no words. Only relief. Only grief. Only rage that had burned so long it now cooled into something harder, sharper. It sat in my chest like a blade. They cuffed Elliot. I saw him flinch as they read his rights. Veronica's scream echoed from the hallway, shrill and furious. My father said nothing. He met my eyes once, then lowered his gaze. There was no apology in his silence, only shame. A female guard knelt beside Clara, whispering gently. I didn't hear the words. Clara clung to me, unmoving. She wouldn't speak until we were downstairs, until the sirens faded and the cold retreated. In the lodge's front hall, surrounded by officers, I finally exhaled. I gave a statement. I handed over the flash drive. I showed them the recording. The truth spilled out in fragments, jagged and incomplete. They pieced it together. Clara pulled away and looked up at me. We're done. Her voice was thin, almost voiceless. I nodded. Yes, we're going home. She leaned into me again. And for the first time in days, she closed her eyes. Spring came slowly, as if the earth itself needed time to believe it had survived the winter. We moved east, into a modest cottage with peeling paint and a sloped roof that creaked in the wind. It was nothing like the lodge, no chandeliers, no curated views. But the windows opened without resistance, and the doors didn't lock themselves. Clara chose her room. She painted the walls pale yellow. She started therapy twice a week. Her counselor said she rarely spoke of hollow pines. But when she did, it was always in symbols, drawings of wolves in the woods, eyes in the trees, a red house crumbling beneath the snow. I didn't press her for words. Some truths need more time to thaw. I returned to nursing, this time at a smaller hospital, where I now work with trauma patients. I sit beside women who can't name what happened but feel it all the same. I hold their hands when the words won't come. I listen, the way I once wished someone had listened to me. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Elliot pled not guilty. So did Veronica. My father never said a word in court. But the evidence was overwhelming, the footage, the documents, the syringe recovered from the lodge. There were whispers about other women, old cases, settlements buried in non-disclosure. Mara's name surfaced in a file. She was never found. Clara testified via video. She cried once. Then she drew a picture of the mountain. The judge kept it. Elliot received 20 years. Veronica 12. My father was given 5, suspended. He moved away. I don't know where. Some nights, Clara wakes up calling my name, but fewer than before. She talks now about school, friends, books. She laughs more. She runs in the yard until the sun goes down and comes back smelling like earth. One evening, she asked, was it all a dream? I told her the truth. No. But we're awake now. And we are. We plant tulips outside the porch. We walk to the grocery store. We paint birdhouses and burn casseroles. We keep the windows open. There are scars. But there is light too. And sometimes, late at night, when Clara is asleep and the house is still, I stand by the window and watch the trees swaying gently beneath the moon. Not all forests are haunted. Some simply remember,